All right. Good. What is it? Morning?
It is morning. Well, for me,
it's pretty morning for me too. I hope everyone has had an awesome weekend. Actually, we had some good weather. What is it? Morning? Wait, that's weird. I'm hearing me. We had some good weather here in Denver. I got some rest because we're about to jam into the hard part of this process.
Yep.
So, welcome everyone to episode 103 of The Raise, in case you missed it. We are presenting to you sort of a real-time interactive series on how to raise money. Now, what's different about The Raise, if you don't know, is that it's not really a workshop or a seminar of any kind. Our goal is actually to give you a behind-the-scenes, front row seat to the research, the decisions, and the actions that I take while I'm actually raising money for my next startup. It's a new company called Fundraising. If in case you want to check it out, you can do so right there. And the interesting thing here is that we're hoping really that, what we found was too often there's a lot of advice out there about like what you're supposed to do, right? But there isn't nearly as much about how we got to those decisions. And so that's what we're trying to show you is really like, what are the things you eliminated in the process of getting to the point where you said, that's my problem, or that's the solution, or that's how I talk about it, or that's how I raise the money. We want you to see the steps up close. So we hope you get a chance to follow along.
And I'm Pankaj, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. In this show, I'm going to be playing the part of mentor, working with Greg and the Fundraising team, and giving them some insight into how angels and VCs think and work. I'll ask the same questions that I ask as an investor. However, I will be also giving some of my insights into the best way to answer the questions and also share what an investor might be thinking, but not necessarily saying. More importantly, we want to know your questions, and we want to answer whatever questions you might have about this whole process that Greg and his team are going through. So ask them in the comments on our website at foundercraft.com or email us at raise@foundercraft.com. So Greg, let's jump right into it.
Let's jump right into it. So episode 103 is actually all about the sort of the checklist. And it's the question we're really trying to answer today is, how should I prepare for fundraising? And so I will have a bunch of questions, but Pankaj has actually prepared quite a bit of notes and thoughts for us. So he's going to largely lead, and I'm going to be asking questions like you. But by all means, if you have questions, let us know what they are, and we will answer them as well. Yes. So here we go.
All right. So how should I prepare for fundraising? Greg, getting started. The first thing that I would recommend is establish which founder is going to be the primary contact for all fundraising activities. This is important because you want to make sure that every lead, every conversation is being funneled to one person. Otherwise, you're going to have different people having different conversations. Of course, all founders are always fundraising, but you want to have one person kind of lead the charge, right? And this is important because you want to have one message, one voice kind of going out, and one person basically keeping track of everything that's happening during the.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what happens if someone like, your one of your co-founders is out somewhere, they bump into someone who might be an investor or something like that? Yeah. Like, what's your advice in that scenario? Like, should they say, hey, I would love to tell you more, or should they try to pitch right then, or would it be best to alley-oop it over to like the main person?
Yeah, so I will get to that in a little bit.
All right.
Great question, and it's an important question. So, before I jump into that, I want to just knock off some of the low-hanging fruit that's like easy stuff that every founder should be doing. So, create an email alias, founders@mystartup.com. Add all founders to that email alias, okay? Update your AngelList profile and make sure it looks professional, with high quality copy, no grammatical or spelling mistakes. Make sure you have a nice video about the product or the company. If you're putting any images up there, make sure they're high quality images, which is not easy and not hard to do these days. So coming back to your question, I think it's really important that all founders and all senior members of a team are engaged in the whole fundraising process. right? But one person is taking charge. Everyone. So what does that mean? You're going to be creating a deck soon, right? So your co-founders should be involved in that process of creating that deck. They should be involved in crafting the story that you're going to be telling, right? Now, of course, one person is going to take the lead, but everyone should be involved in that. Every founder should be involved in building out your lead list of what investors you want to go out and pitch to. And it's important that you guys identify together what your high-level pitch is, what the various KPIs are that you're going to be talking about, and sharing them across the team so that whenever they are at an event or at a coffee shop and sitting next to them is an investor and they overhear and they start asking questions and the KPIs, you can socialize them effectively, you can give the high-level pitch, but if somebody says, hey, I'm interested, and say, okay, great, I'm going to introduce you to Greg, my co-founder, who's kind of leading the fundraising process, and he'll take it over from here. So all the founders should be able to tell the story. They should be able to talk about where you're at and have a high-level pitch, 30-second, 1-minute pitch available to them. But you don't really necessarily want them to go out and say, all right, here's my deck and let's go through this and blah, blah, blah. You want to have that channeled into one place.
Got you. So really, it's more, everyone should be a salesperson for the pitch process.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily the closer.
Well, absolutely. And, the reason for this is, a lot of founders might be the engineers, right? And they may not be focusing on the business side of things as much. They may not be good or experienced at closing deals, right? They can talk about the product, they can talk about the vision, but they can't necessarily, sell the company, right? So this is a good way for them to be involved in the process and also feel like they have a important role to play in the process, but at the same time, pushing the fundraising activities to one founder who has that experience, who can close deals, who has, it's not necessarily the right way to put it, but has a little bit of a sales and business way of approaching closing the deal, right? So sometimes that is better, not necessarily all the time. There are some investors who are also engineers and they don't care about the salesy and the business side. They want to dive right into the engineering and they want to talk about the product. They want to talk about how you're building out your back end, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes that works. So this way, it's good to have everyone involved in the process. So everyone kind of knows like, hey, you know what? You need to come with me on this meeting because this investor that we're pitching is an engineer, and we know this investor wants to dive deep into the technology. And if that's the case, well, having somebody who's deep in the technology can, you can create a connection with that investor a little more easily, right? So having that is really important.
That's a good segue, I guess, to the next part of your presentation, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And this is unfortunately, I think, one of the things that most founders don't spend enough time on. Research. It's incredibly important, and it can make your fundraising process a lot more effective and a lot quicker. Build a lead list while you're researching, right? And you want to approach fundraising similarly to a sales process because that's what you're doing. You're selling a piece of your company to somebody, right? You can use all the tools that you do for a sales process if you like. Some people like to just use a spreadsheet and say, okay, here's a list of the investors and here's their email addresses. This is when I last contacted them, and this is how much I think they can invest, and this is the likelihood of them investing, right? So a couple of key criteria that a lot of people just track that stuff in a spreadsheet. You could do it through a CRM if you like, but have that lead list. Start putting that lead list together. And as you add potential folks, for some founders, it might be like, hey, we're just going to sit in a room. It's like, hey, who do you know? Who's an investor? Let's just make a list of all those people. Right. So let's just throw everybody into that list. And then afterwards, now it's like, all right, now let's go research these people because not everyone knows them. Not everyone may know them as an investor. They may have worked with them in the past, but they became an investor afterwards. So it's imperative to research and do due diligence on investors. Most people don't spend enough time doing that, and that's why they wind up speaking to hundreds, if not more, of investors, and they get only a few that wind up putting money in, right? Because you're not targeting the right investor, right? If somebody's used to investing in B2B enterprise and you are primarily a consumer company, there's no reason to go pitch that B2B investor, right? Even though they may be a great investor, they don't invest in the space. They may still take the meeting, but it's a waste of their time and your time, right? So doing that research really helps you figure out who should you attack. And it's important to categorize them, right, according to a whole bunch of different categories that you can come up with, based on kind of what you're looking for. And I think it's important to prioritize what you're looking for up front. So if you are looking for somebody that can help you hire a management team, right, that might be a higher priority for you. Categorize them and prioritize them according to that. If you're if you're looking for somebody that can help with BD, right, then maybe prioritize them higher, et cetera, et cetera. So for you, it's got to be, that's part of your research, to sit down and say, what is most important for us over the next 6 or 12 months before we raise that next round of funding? What do we really need to do, and what do we need help with, right? And I think some of these questions kind of tie in together pretty closely. So obviously, an investor that you want to speak to is used to investing at the stage that you're raising money at, and in the vertical that you're raising money in, right? Do they write check sizes in the range you're looking for, right? So if you're looking to raise a $2 million round and the investor writes 50K checks, is that the best use of time? You still may want to pitch them, because it can eventually, you get 3 or 4 50K checks, it gets you a little bit closer to closing out the round. But are they the first people that you necessarily want to go after, right? There's no right or wrong answer, but it's important to know that. I think this is something that all founders should be doing. Founders have a tendency to speak to other founders and tell other founders off the record things that they wouldn't necessarily say in public, right? So right. I think it's really useful for founders to reach out to other founders and speak to at least 5 founders that an investor has invested in the past. I think the most telling is speaking to founders that have failed, right? They'll tell you, how was an investor to work with? And, especially when you were failing, right? What happened? And I think that's really useful for founders to know. You probably want to know, does the investor take board seats? What stage do they take board seats at? Specifically, are they helpful, and what can they help with? Do they lead rounds, either this round or the next round? These are all things that I think are incredibly important for founders to ask themselves. And I'm sure there are others also. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is, you guys are at the stage now where you're going to start working on your deck. You should be putting your lead list together. You've been talking to a few folks about what you're doing. So now let's structure your process for trying to raise, and let's start asking what's important to you, and let's start putting some structure around that and doing some research to answer those questions so that your fundraising process is as productive as it can be.
Yeah. So some questions, I guess.
Yeah.
So inside of, and I think that's a great list. And I do think like the research is a thing that, I think is really important. Like I think a lot of people haven't, they don't pay enough attention to. So what we've been doing so far is, we've been sort of trying, I think, like you said, sort of kind of loosely starting to I've started a couple of spreadsheets to sort of start to organize folks and whatnot. What are your thoughts on sort of like finding or getting access to the other founders? I mean, I know we were in YC in the past, so I think we have a lot of access and we can ask a bunch of people. And Peter was in Techstars, so we have another batch of people that we have access to. But let's say you're not us, right? Yeah. How do you get in touch with those founders? Or obviously a lot of people do this, founders at email address. I mean, I guess it's a potentially useful thing.
Yep.
Do you have any tips on that for folks?
Yeah. So, I think Twitter is a great place to start engaging with folks, not just founders, but investors as well. Start following the right people, start having conversations with them about things that are important to them. That way you're not some random person on the internet that's trying to take away time that is very valuable for them. So I think, using Twitter is a great way to start establishing some sort of conversation and some sort of, at least, way to recognize you. After that, I think if you can get their email address from somewhere, a lot of founders, I think, have been very receptive to other founders. Of course, you want to be respectful of their time and their availability. So, I think it's important to just be very direct and say, look, this is what I'm doing. I know so-and-so has invested in your company, and I'm thinking about pitching this person, and I'd like to just take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever you think is reasonable of your time to ask you some questions. If you're free for coffee, I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee. Otherwise, if you have time to talk on the phone, I'd like to just ask you some questions about raising money, and specifically from this investor, something like that. Right?
Yeah, I've seen that. And I can say now I do get a lot of inbounds often from people who want to know. I would say like something that I would appreciate if you were reaching out to me, or if as I'm going to reach out, I include the questions you have.
Yeah,
right. Like
that's helpful.
Because like at least they may be like, you may reach a founder, like for example, like in my last company, Ranveer raised our round, so like I didn't have as much direct access to our investors.
Yeah.
So a lot of times if they're asking me like questions about like the fundraising process, it's separate than like working with them after the fact, right?
Yep.
And so like knowing that up front, I could just be like, sorry, like I didn't actually do the fundraising, I didn't negotiate with them, I didn't sit across from them, so it's harder for me to tell you, all the ins and outs of that. But if you want to know like what I thought about them as people, or or as an investor, I absolutely could provide that insight. So I think doing your homework about the founder, if they've already written about it potentially or talked about it, then that'd be another place for you to look at to try and learn first before you get to them.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. A lot of founders do have blog posts about, raising their round and what investors they've worked with and how was the process, or, if they shut down their company, what investors really stepped up and really supported them through the shutdown process. So, that's part of the research, right? Absolutely. So I think those are really good points.
So I have another question.
Yeah.
Relative to, I know you were saying sort of taking into consideration the check size and some of those things. It feels to me at least like where I'm going to start is where I have access, right?
Yeah.
And so like sort of the low hanging fruit is kind of where you naturally start.
Yeah.
And so you might have access to a friend or an angel that's just like they could cut a check for $10,000 and whatnot.
Absolutely.
How much, or what advice do you have, I guess, around there's a call sheet still, right? Like so like just like in classic in sales, like we score leads, right? Like how would you recommend scoring sort of like your investor list, like relative to like trying to figure out a sort order for like who I should contact and in what order, presuming I could contact all of them?
Yeah. Okay. So, I think scoring is a tough one, but, look, raising money has a lot to do with who you know and who knows you, right? So if an investor is getting an introduction to you from a successful founder, right, you're not necessarily more likely to raise money, but you're more likely to get a meeting for sure. And you're probably going to have somebody that is interested in what you have to say because of who made the introduction, right? And that's why introductions are so important in this space. So once you've gotten that step in the door, I think, folks that have made introductions and folks that are high quality introductions, immediately, I think those would be scored a little bit higher than if you are reaching out to somebody on Twitter or cold, right? So I think that's one way. The other thing that I think would really help is for you, once you started the process and you started engaging with a particular investor, you'll immediately know what, based on kind of what questions they're asking, whether it's over email or in person. You'll immediately know, like, where's this going? You'll get a sense for it, and I think based on that, you can score some of these investors that way as well, right? Just based on the conversations that you're having with them. At the end of the day, I don't know if scoring them is that important necessarily.
Yeah, and I guess I don't necessarily mean like a literal score, but I
Yeah,
guess
yeah. Likely to close, unlikely to close.
Well, or even I guess more like the blocking and tackling. Like, if I know I got to raise, say, 750, like we're thinking about, right?
Yeah.
I kind of know I want to wait. Logically, I should want to wait meetings to like people who can do the larger check. Or a lot of times, like I know, like a lot of people don't want to invest unless you have like a quote unquote lead, right?
Yep.
And so, in some ways, I guess I'm torn on it. Are you trying to find the lead first, right? Or are you just trying to start to create like a groundswell of like interest?
Yeah.
Because this is a classic problem you always hear. People are like, I'm in if you have a lead. But then, like, what's a lead? I mean, technically, the biggest investment is the lead, right? Like, so
the biggest investor, or in some cases, not even the biggest investor, but one of the larger investors who are ready to set terms with you and give you a term sheet, right? That's who the lead is. And yeah, I mean, look, I used to do that at 500. We never led rounds, so I would regularly say, look, I'd be the first person a founder would talk to. I'd say, yeah, I'm in. You got to find a lead. I can't set terms with you because somebody else might come along and be like, hey, these terms are ridiculous. So, find somebody who's ready to set terms, and, based on whether I think those terms are reasonable or not, yes. So it's a conditional yes. So yeah, I think your question is a really good one. And I think a lot of it depends on the stage that you're raising money at, right? So for a pre-seed round, you're probably not going to go to institutional investors. Many angels don't necessarily look for a lead, right? And in a lot of cases, like I think we talked about this last episode, where you could self-lead the round, right? Which is basically just looking at the market and saying, okay, companies that are raising right now at our stage are typically doing rounds between here and here. And we might fall at the earlier end of the spectrum or the later end. And based on that, we can, turn the dial on what the cap on that note or safe might be. But if you're a slightly later stage, if you're looking to raise like a pre-series A or a series A, yeah, then I think it's probably worth you spending more time trying to find a lead and getting that lead to jump in. Because a lot of times what could happen if you're a slightly later stage company is if you don't get a lead, you get a bunch of smaller investors to say yes. Then a lead comes in and says, wait a minute, 60% of your round is already full. I need 70% of the round.
Right.
So now you got to go back and either push everybody down or push them out. And now suddenly that becomes a really ugly conversation to start having with folks who put on you, or at least agreed to move ahead with you early on. Right.
And this is, by the way, I do think, to your point, this is one of those things when you're researching, or if you do talk to founders, like that data point will come up. Like, they like to be in, or someone will tell you they don't like to, they only follow on, right? Like, if something else happens. And so if you're, pegging your hopes on something, like you can plan it one way or the other.
Exactly. So, at your stage, I would say it's probably good to start talking to everybody. Especially people that the people that are the best cheerleaders out there for you, right? Because these are folks that know you, they've worked with you, they've trusted you, they've invested in you, they've made money with you. So getting them to commit and getting them to make introductions to other folks is a good starting point, right? And so I don't think you necessarily have to worry about institutional investors and leads and stuff right now.
Okay.
For this particular round, right? At least for that first let's say 250, 300K that we've been talking
Right.
about, you don't have to worry about that. And when you've got 250, 300 in the bank, now you can go out and say, all right, should we now, since we already have a group of people that have invested in us, should we start looking at, some micro VCs and other smaller or early stage investors that might do 250K checks or 300K checks that aren't necessarily looking for leads, but the terms are already set, so they're happy to do the deal at those terms, or perhaps slight bump to those terms.
Yeah. Now, just a separate, another question, just related, and you sort of alluded to some of this, were there sites or anything that you like for like researching? Like, are there good places to?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff not really public, right? CB Insights is great. Of course, you got to have a subscription to really use it effectively. But even their newsletter has a lot of good information. So if you can get like back newsletters and like dive into some of that, and then they put up some reports publicly. So CB Insights is really good because you can get a good idea of who's investing in what verticals, how much they're investing, who are some of their co-investors, et cetera, et cetera. So CB Insights is really great for that. I think Crunchbase is pretty good for getting a lot of information also. There's a lot of, not all information, but there's a good amount of information about investors, where they've invested, who they've invested with, what verticals they've invested in, what geographies they're investing in. So you can kind of like extrapolate a lot of information by looking people up on Crunchbase as well. Mm-hmm. AngelList it's good because a lot of folks do have their portfolios up there, so you can get some idea of what they've invested in, but how much they've invested is not necessarily available, and you can't necessarily see what stage they invested in, right? So, that could be a challenge, but if you combine some of these things together, like go to AngelList, you can see my portfolio, then you know which companies I've invested in. Now you can go and research those companies on Crunchbase and see, potentially which round did I invest in.
Yeah. I'll add a little thing here that I have seen from knowing some investors or a number of investors. You should be careful also because sometimes people, they like their resumes to look nice also. So, someone wants to say like they're an investor in Twitter and maybe they got like a tiny allocation, like as a gift, not actually because they were like seriously vetted as like an investor or something like that. And so this is part of why talking to, people like really helps you understand, because it could be a false signal, right? Like some people just like want to be part of good or sexy deals because that helps create, that's their marketing, right? For like how they get deal flow and people to come to them. I think a side of this conversation that is important but not often talked about actually is really like an investor's interest in deal flow, right? And for everyone who doesn't understand, maybe could you explain just a little bit about the process, like what it looks like from your side to be on the receiving end, and sort of also like, I guess, the activities or types of work that you're doing to also create that, because I think it's an important part of the process that like as a normal sort of uninvolved entrepreneur or first-time entrepreneur, you may not really understand or see sort of what's going on. And you may actually feel offended by the process, but not really because you don't understand all the parts that are playing.
Yeah. So, as markets become competitive, investors have to fight for deals, and they have to, people talk about proprietary deal flow all the time. I don't really think proprietary deal flow exists anymore. I think you create brands, and a lot of investors go out and have brands, whether it's the fund or it's an individual at a fund, and that attracts a certain amount of deal flow, inbound deal flow. So, what do investors do? Investors do stuff like what we're doing right now, right? We'll do podcasts, we'll do videos, we'll speak at events, we will make ourselves available for office hours to founders, we'll blog, we'll tweet, so there's plenty of ways that investors are putting themselves out there so that people know that they're out there, they are ready to write checks, and they try to attract deal flow that way. Is that always a well thought out marketing strategy? No, I don't think so. I think for most folks, we go out and we say, all right, well, blogging today for most investors is like table stakes. If you're a VC and you're not blogging, why? you have to be, right? Now people are moving in, deeper into the podcasting space. So, most VC firms have podcasts, and partners at those firms are on those podcasts on a regular basis, talking about different topics. And this is a way to create deal flow for your firm and for yourself, right? Even within a firm, you're competing with your other partners also for deal flow, right? So everyone's trying to attract the best possible deal flow they possibly can. As an investor, you will see a lot of deals that are not necessarily a fit. You will see deals that may look really good on paper, but don't necessarily look that great when you start unpacking things. So sometimes you have to go through the process a little bit before you realize, no, this isn't going to be a fit for me or for my firm. And then you have other deals that are coming to you from other founders that you've invested in that have been successful. You respect their opinions, coming to you from senior management at startups that you've invested in. So you're trying to build relationships with all of those people to push high quality deals to you. And the reason you try to do that is because you can filter stuff, right? Otherwise, like on my blog, I have a page that just says pitch me, right? Because I have a lot of people that keep trying to get in touch with me on social media, email, all kinds of stuff. And, it's, as an individual, it's hard for me to be able to filter through all of this stuff quickly and effectively. So as a VC, I might have a team behind me where I can say, look, this deal came in from, a conference I was at, can you run through it really quickly and just see if it's worth pursuing? As an individual, it's not, or at a small VC firm, it's not necessarily easy for me to do that, right? Because the amount of time I'm spending on a deal that may not work out is deal that I'm not spending on a deal that could work out, right? So, optimizing where you're spending your time becomes really important for VCs. And sometimes founders see that as arrogance. Sometimes they see that as being somewhat aloof. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, of course, I can't speak for each individual investor's personalities, but that's not necessarily the case. I think VCs and angels are just trying to optimize their time and spend as much time as possible on good deals that are going to work, or at least good deals that are going to work out in the terms of them being able to invest, right? And once you're invested, now it's a portfolio company, so it's different. You need to spend time with your portfolio companies to help them. So I hope that answers the question.
No, it does, because not that I want to have sympathy on the investor side, but I do think like understanding where you fit in the workflow of things like is helpful in understanding the feedback or lack of feedback that you do get.
Yeah, and I think that's a real important thing that you brought up there. I think one of the challenges that I think founders constantly deal with is a lack of feedback from investors. A lot of investors don't give any feedback of, why did they pass on a deal? What did they not like about a particular deal? And I think those things could be very helpful for founders. But at the same time, I've seen this again and again, where I try to be very transparent with founders, and I try to tell them, like, look, this is why I don't like your deal. You're over diluted, or you're not targeting your market the right way, or you haven't built up your team, or whatever the reason is. And I've seen founders become very defensive. And I always try to preface that and say, look, this is just my opinion, and please take it for what it's worth. If you wanted to pitch me, so I think it's important that I share with you what's important for me when I'm writing a check. And this is where you don't match that. So because you don't match that, I want to tell you so that it could be helpful for you in future pitches. Some founders take it really well and they find that helpful, and others don't. So I think that's one reason why a lot of investors are worried about being too transparent and providing feedback.
Huh. And very interesting. It's weird. I mean, obviously, being on the other side, it feels like crap. But I think it is not. again, I think to your broader point of if you have done the research, right, you actually should not be that surprised, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a whole bunch that tells you about how you got to where you are. And then there's a little bit at the end that's sort of like, well, look, you've got to imagine there's probably 100 other deals at the exact same time for them to consider.
Yeah.
And so, this is a game of optimization, right? Like if you can bring forward all of the things that you do have going for you, all the relationships that can vouch for you, right? All of the traction in the data that can verify like the direction of your business, you mitigate more and more of that, right? And then at the end, it could still be like, well, someone just doesn't like you over there. And guess what? It's their prerogative, right? Like,
right?
It's okay. Like, everyone isn't going to like you. So don't worry about it.
Yeah.
There's plenty out there. Now you had, you mentioned something earlier, and it's one that stuck out to me as well. And it's kind of related to this in the sort of social realm of this part of the business, right? But introductions, right? And I think it's worth tackling from 2 points of view, right? I think there's obviously an investor introduction, and I think like is there advice you have about like what to ask for ahead of time, et cetera, and what to expect in that regard. And then I think there's also like for people who ask founders for introductions. I'll tell you, for example, like in our consulting work that we do, like with FounderCraft, I almost always guarantee people that I won't introduce them to someone, right? Like I start out, my position is no, like I won't make an intro.
Yeah.
And it's not because I don't believe in what you're doing, right? Like, but there's so many things that are at play when I make an introduction,
Absolutely.
right? That if you step into that person's shoes, you actually understand this other side a lot better, right? Absolutely. And like I can see a great idea, a great startup, a great execution, but they want to talk to somebody because they haven't done the research. They don't realize that person doesn't like this. They don't understand that that person's taking a pause right now. They don't understand that person's actually their fund is near the end, right? Like, and they don't have any more new investments to make, right? Like, so a lot of times it's easier as a starting point to be like, we don't make introductions, right? And then I'd rather make an exception more so than have it be like, why you come work with us is for introductions.
Yeah. Look, introductions are a tricky thing. Like you said, there's so much involved when somebody asks you for an introduction. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about that in advance when they ask for an introduction. I have people that I don't know drop me emails and ask me for introductions to all kinds of folks. And I'm like, well, I don't know you. How could I introduce you?
I don't know. I get those all the time. I'm like, why would you even think to ask that?
Yeah, exactly. So, regardless of whether it's an investor or a founder, those kinds of introductions are weird. Yeah. At the same time, there are founders and investors that ask me for introductions folks that I know that will ask me for introductions. So I have investors asking me for introductions to founders, and I have founders asking me for introductions to other founders or investors. And if I know you and I think that there is something reasonable in the introduction, and I think that it will be at least a non-negative outcome for me as far as my relationships go, then I'll consider doing it. In my work, I tell people right up front, it's like, look, if you're asking me to help you with your fundraise, that's great. But I will not make any introductions. I will not help you raise money. I will help you figure out your fundraising strategy and how you should approach fundraising and everything that goes along with that. I might even come along with you if you want to a meeting, but I will not make any introductions. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. And many of them immediately, tune out because it's like, well, you just want access to the Rolodex. Well, okay, that's fair. I get it. But, there's reasons why people can't do that. So, I think whether it's a founder asking for a introduction to another founder or to an investor, I think what we talked about earlier is important, right? Like, be upfront. Why do you want this introduction? How do you think it could be mutually beneficial? If it can, if it can't, be very clear that you're asking somebody to make an introduction because you need something, but it may not necessarily be in their benefit in any sort of way. But, some people are happy to help out. Okay, that's fine. As long as you know exactly why. And, the other thing you want to think about is, if you're asking somebody for an introduction, is this somebody that you know well that has something positive to say about you? Because if they don't ask them for an introduction.
Mm-hmm.
If they do, be very clear with them on why you want the introduction, and, what are you looking to get out of this introduction, and make it easy and simple for that person to just forward it on, or just reply back and say, sorry, I can't do this. Right.
Yeah. Actually, just on style, I do think that it's important, I think, for you to, I've seen a couple approaches with this, and I think they have different, they're potentially both valuable from my point of view. One is where it's written in a way that can be forwarded like immediately. And I think that this only works when you know that person really well. You maybe had a conversation with them ahead of time. And like, usually what I will say to someone is like, send me something I can forward.
Yep.
Right. And so that way it's coming properly. And then I'll just add like a note at the top of it. Right. Like, that's one good format, I think, about it.
Yep.
Right. A second is, I think, if you're doing that outreach, potentially like say to like founders or, to a founder who may help you, you've got to make that quick pitch about your company.
Yep.
That thing should theoretically, like, I would not have anything in there that would be offensive, right?
Yeah.
So, right, like, because you have to assume this is freaking digital ages, my friends. Like, anything could get forwarded, and if that person's like, cool, like whatever, and they're not paying as much attention as you are, and they didn't notice at the end, you're like, did you like these people, right? Like, you don't want that in there, right? Like, as sort of, or I've heard some bad stuff about these guys, but I wanted to know why you went with them, right?
Yeah.
Don't have crap like that in there, right? Like, be as diplomatic as possible in all of your sort of conveyance with people, because someone may be trying to help you out and not realize that they undo something for you in the process, right?
Yep.
So I do think, like, what I would say is, like, if you are chatting with someone that's new and you're trying to work your way towards potentially an introduction, I would make it clear up front that, hey, I understand that, it may not be a good fit. You may not be close enough, whatever it may be. And if you are, if at some point you do feel like it is, I'm happy to send you something you can forward to them, right? Like, so that way, at least you sort of set the precedent that, like, okay, look, if you decide at some point you'd like to make an intro, like, let me do it let me prepare you to do it, right?
Yeah.
Whenever that moment does come, right? But I think, like, you don't put the guilt or the doubt or the blame on the other person, like from the outset of the transaction, quote unquote, right? I think that's kind of like ridiculous if you're not taking some of that on your own.
I agree completely. Those are good, very good points.
So, just looking back to a couple of the other thing, how long should you research in it? Like, do you recommend that, like, should you do all your research and then you start, or is it a rolling kind of thing?
I think it's rolling. I don't think it's like, I don't think it's something that you're doing in a serialized fashion. I think what you're doing is, hey, I know Bunkage, and I want to talk to Bunkage, but I'm not necessarily sure whether Bunkage invests in this category. Let me do some quick research, find out. Let me throw it into my spreadsheet. And, once I have all my material, you're going to create your email templates and your deck and everything. So you're going to have all that stuff ready. Once I have all that stuff ready, if Bunkage fits into that likelihood of investing, being helpful, and whatever priorities you have, now you can just fire that off, right? So I don't think it's necessarily you have to wait till you're done with everything before you kind of reach out to everyone, right?
But you probably should spool up some, like.
Yeah. I think you want to try to build some momentum. Just from your own perspective, it's like, look, if you talk to one investor today and then you talk to another one in 3 weeks, you're not really building up that momentum, that energy in your own process, right? So if you've got like 5 or 6, you reach out to one of them, responds, and you kind of start the process with that one, then have another 5 that you're ready to go with, or another 2, and just have a bunch of them that you're ready to start going with, right? So how long you should spend on research, I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is, can you do the research to get the answers to the questions that you have, right? Okay. So I shared a couple of sample questions that I think are useful in asking when you're going through the process. You may have additional questions, or you may find that some of these questions are not necessarily relevant for you, so that's okay. But have your questions, and as long as you can get answers to the questions that you think are important, that's fine. If you could do that research in 10 minutes, wonderful.
Yeah. And I guess the last question, as we're running towards time.
Yep.
What about paperwork, I guess? I know a lot of your preparation sort of ended at the research, but is there any other stuff, diligence? Is there any other preparation? And I know we will get into some of this, more of this as we get into the other decks. But is there other things like?
Yeah.
Do I need my lawyer by now? Like things like that.
So I mean, look, you're likely going to have already gotten a lawyer together to get your incorporation and all that stuff done, your agreements and things like that. At an early stage, like a pre-seed type of deal, like what you guys are doing, I don't think you really need to worry about that. Most investors are not going to ask for copies of your vesting agreements. They're not going to ask for copies of your employment agreements or anything like that. Your company's barely been around for a couple of months, so no one's going to really ask for audited financials or bank statements or anything like that, right? But when you're doing slightly larger rounds, if you're raising $1 million or more, a seed or pre-series A type of round, then it's helpful to have that stuff available. I don't think people are going to ask you for that stuff immediately. I think people will ask for that stuff if they're moving towards a term sheet, and that's usually institutional investors, right? So even micro VCs might come in and say, okay, great, we're ready to put 200K in or 300K in, but we need to do some due diligence, so we'll need a copy of your vesting agreements, we'll need a copy of your employment agreement, your ESOP agreement, your financials, even if they're not audited, for the last year, or 2 years or whatever. So people will ask for that stuff, but that generally will come later. So I don't necessarily see it as stuff that you have to have in place before you start reaching out to investors. Again, that could be something that's rolling, and you're kind of getting that stuff together as you are moving closer to getting a term sheet from an investor. And a lot of investors will tell you, in the meeting where they say, look, we're at least verbally committing to doing this deal. Now we're gonna give you a term sheet, and we'll move into the due diligence phase. Here's all the stuff that we're gonna need from you. So I see this research phase as more of founders using their time to do due diligence on investors.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and it is important. I think like you shouldn't go into this blind, and don't get that frenzy of I'll just warn, don't be that person either. Like there's lots of events where you may meet investors. Do not start pitching them like the first time you encounter them, right? Like
the best is like you're standing in a crowd of like 40 people, and suddenly everyone's throwing pitch decks at you.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what we do, and we're raising money, and like okay, but so are 30 of these other guys also.
Yeah. Show some restraint, my friend. And look, I've been there. Trust me. Like I think when I met Sumit, like it was after like he was a VC on a panel, and that was the first encounter when he asked like what I told him about lograms, and I definitely told him more than I needed to tell him at that point. I think like you got to play it cool. Get your figure out what the most salient point of like what you're doing is and why it's valuable. Say I'd love to follow up. If they're willing to give you their card for a follow up, then great. If not, then show how resilient you are, how persistent you are, and like find them,
Yeah.
get and find your way to get through to them in a way that surprises them. Right. I think that's the right way to do it. So we are just at 10:54. I don't see any comments, but it could be me. But by all means, you don't have to ask them in real time. Obviously, we know folks have different schedules for viewing this show. So at any point in time, if you do want to ask a question, if you're watching this later, you can obviously just leave them down below. You can also just shoot us an email at raise@foundercraft.com. Pankaj, do you have any closing thoughts?
Don't underestimate how much time it takes doing the research. It does take a lot of time. And it's really important. It does take a lot of time. Don't underestimate how much time it's going to take, because that time up front is hopefully going to make things a lot easier for you going forward.
Without a doubt. And in case you don't know, I'm just going to hide us from the stream real quick here. Our next episode is going to be a week from today, on Monday at
same time.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're on for the same time.
Same time. Let me get that back in there. Oh yeah, just the last slide of that deck. I've got the date and time on there. But yeah, our next show will be episode 104 on Monday, a week from today. And we will be looking at
starting work on your pitch deck.
We're not gonna work on my deck yet, I think. Are we?
I think we are. I think we're gonna start working on your deck.
Damn. All right, I was hoping that wasn't the case. But we are gonna start talking about the pitch deck itself, in depth. Pankaj, can you navigate to the last slide in the deck?
Yeah. Where'd it go? I have too many windows open.
There you go.
Why is it? No,
it's weird. I added one, and I see it, but you should see it.
That's weird.
Oh, maybe because you were presenting, and
maybe it's locked in some way.
Maybe it's locked. Yeah.
All right. Well,
but anyway, it's a week from today, next Thursday, and so we should be starting. Sorry, next Monday at 10 a.m. and we will actually start taking a look at some of the fundamentals of building your deck. I know in that episode we will be talking about some of the different kinds of decks that we think you should have to prepare. So some of the higher level structural things.
Yep.
And then we'll also be I think we'll start taking a look at actually like what's going to be in my deck. Oh yeah, you're right. Crap. Yep. So we'll be looking specifically at the problem slide. I think the solution slide. In that first episode as well.
Perhaps the TAM slide.
Perhaps the TAM slide. Yes, because part 2 has traction, biz model, and competition. So yeah, I got some homework to do before the next episode.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be that this is stuff that you have to get ready beforehand. That we can.
I'm trying to. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but I'm just saying, we can start working on the deck live. Right?
Yeah, totally.
People could jump in and, add their comments and share their thoughts on, the problem and the solution. If they've got thoughts on the total addressable market size, they can also contribute to that as well. So that might be an interesting thing.
Well, and I think so, because I have got lots of facts and approaches that I've sort of brainstormed. But like I was saying earlier, the hard part a lot of times is figuring out what's the best. What's the best? If you're photographing something, like there's like certain angles that maybe make it look better than other angles. Yeah. And I feel like as a founder, when I'm looking at my problem, since it's so close to it, all the edges seem equal. Yeah. Right. All right. And so that little perspective is what I hope to gain next week is sharing like the broad problem, talking about it, showing you some candidates I have for sort of like the problem as I think about it. Yeah. And then having you sort of give some feedback about like which one you think is sort of the ideal one.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been wonderful. It's been very informative. I've learned a lot. I hope you have as well. We look forward to seeing you next week. I think we actually have 2 episodes next week.
Yeah, I think you're right.
There's Monday and Friday, I believe.
Yep. We got part 1 of the pitch deck on Monday and part 2 of the pitch deck on Friday next week.
Yes. Okay. Great. Wonderful for me. And
then we have 2 episodes back to back right before Thanksgiving.
Yes, I know. But if you do want to find the whole schedule, head over to foundercraft.com/raise. You can actually add any of the upcoming episodes to your calendar as well. We will share them up to social ahead of time so you have some reminders. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.